Hello, everybody. I want you to shout something out. I want you to shout, howdy do.
Howdy do.
Well, howdy do to you too. My name is Lou, and that's enough rhyme even for Mother Goose. I'm here today because, well, you know, it's spring, and in spring, they say that a young man's fancy turns to thoughts of
Love.
barbecue.
Right.
No,
Barbecue.
it's love, you're right. So I thought I would tell you some Wiley Oakley stories about Wiley and his wife Rebecca and some of the courting customs in the Smoky Mountains. Well, the first story is called, I call it Three Boys Courtin'. Well, one time Wiley and two of his buddies decided that they wanted to go courting. They were young, maybe Wiley was 15 years old, I'm not quite sure. That had been about 1900. And he and his two friends knew a farmer who had 3 daughters. They said, well, we'll just go try out some courting there. So they headed towards this cabin where the man lived. And on the way they talked about what are we going to do when we get there, because they didn't know nothing about courting. And they decided, well, we'll just sit close to them and we'll try to get in good with them as much as we can. So they got to the cabin and the people welcomed them, they knew them, invited them to come in and set a spell on the porch. So they had a good little visit there, and I'm sure the boys and girls were looking at one another out the corner of their eyes. And night was coming on in the Smokies, and so the family said, well, why don't you just stay and have victuals with us and you can spend the night. Now, spending the night did not mean that the boys would be sleeping in the bed with the gals. No, not at all. The boys would be sleeping over the bedroom up in the attic or loft, I'll call it. So the evening went on, it was time to go to bed. So the boys went outside the cabin, and there was a pole ladder out there, and they climbed up that ladder up to the loft. Now the loft had a puncheon floor in it. Puncheon floor, that means the boards were not these sawed mill boards, nice and even. A puncheon floor is made out of a chunk of a tree trunk or a tree. And it was cut in half, and then the flat halves were put down as the floor with, you know, the notched in so it could fit over the joust there. And it was sometimes planed down with an axe or an asp so they wouldn't have quite so many splinters on it. So that was the kind of floor that was up in the loft. Sections of this puncheon floor from joust to joust, from joust to joust. And they were big old wide boards. Well, the boys went up there and they started stripping down to go to sleep on the pallet up there. Well, one of the boys sort of lost interest in getting undressed because, you know, tree trunks are a little bit irregular. So there are big gaps in that puncheon floor. So the boy was looking down there, he said, come on over, boys. So they went over and they looked down this big crack. Said, oh my Lord, look at there. The gal's undressing for bed. And oh, they were just so excited about that. Well, one of the boys on that board that he was kneeling on looking down, it must have not been quite long enough, or maybe he was so excited it was jiggling, I don't know what it was. But the board fell through and so did that boy. Kerplop, right down on one of the beds down there. And oh, you never heard such a hollering going on like a fox in a hen house down there. And oh, the girls was covered up and the boy was covered up and they were just sort of embarrassed. And oh, the farmer, he was just so sad about it. Oh, I'm so sorry, son. I apologize. We ain't got no nails, so the board was just laid in up there. And I'm so sorry it happened to you. I hope you didn't hurt yourself. Please forgive us. Well, the boy was awful embarrassed, and he had on his long johns, but he was white as a ghost when he went back up in the loft. So he went outside and climbed up that pole ladder, got back up in the loft. They put that board back. Well, Wiley doesn't say in his story, but I just imagine that those boys had very quiet giggling going on, thinking about what had just happened. And I would imagine that any time they met in the years to come, that those 3 boys just had a great big old laugh out of the adventure they had had at that cabin that night. But I am for certain sure that those 3 boys never told that family what had gone on that night. They had come there, they had dropped in to do some courting, then they'd gone up in the loft and they'd done some eavesdropping, and then one of the boys fell through the rafters there and went ker-plop. And that's Wiley's story about 3 boys a-courting. Now I want to tell you about courting in the Smoky Mountains. Thank you. Courting in the Smokies, of course, was quite different than it is now, with texting and cell phones and lots of people gathered together at schools and events, because back then families lived in pretty isolated situations. The farms were often very far apart. So in the fall was a very good time for people to get together. They would have molasses pulling was one thing, but the one I want to tell you about is the corn shucking time. Now, corn shucking in the fall, when the corn was ripe and they pulled it off the stalks there and took it back to the farm, there's a lot of corn. And so farmers would often get together with help one another out, and they would help one another shuck that corn to get it ready for winter, for storage. Well, the youth really liked that corn shucking time because it gave them a time to eyeball who was out there, the boys and the girls that were in the neighborhood. And they really loved one of the customs. And it made them shuck that corn even faster than they would, because if they found a red ear of corn, they got to kiss their sweetheart. I guess that was called sweet corn. Another custom at that time was called casting of sheep eyes. And of course that meant you got a sheep and you gouged out the eyes and you throwed them and you cast them at a gal that you liked. And if you believe that, then it's about time for Wiley to yodel, because that is a tall tale. That ain't true at all. Don't believe it. Casting sheep eyes means that a fellow who had a hanking for a gal, he would try to get her off by herself, cut her out of the herd. And when they were sort of alone, he would look up at her real shy-like, and he would cast those big, pretty eyes that were just dripping with honey. And if the gal liked him back, she'd cast those sheep eyes, those goo-goo eyes, right back at him. And that meant that the courting could commence. He might be able to walk her home from church, which, by the way, in the church they were sort of separated even then, because the girls and the women had to sit on the left-hand side of the church, and the boys and the men sat on the right-hand side of the church. But now, if the gal did not like the boy, she would give him sour looks and mean stares. And that meant that the boy just might as well call the dogs off, because the fox hunt was over.